Buenos días, buenas tardes, y buenas noches, bonjour, bonsoir, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night, wherever you may be. John George case, and it's been a while since we've dug into this. Been a while. One of the problems I'm facing, I've said it many times, I'll say it again, is it seems that every single news outlet these days that covers this case they just have the paywall up there. I don't pay to get into a news article. And even though some of you good people have sent me links to get around the whole paywall thing, it just doesn't seem to work for me. So I can't say right now that I am the most up to date on the John George case, but I do want to offer some insights based on what's been happening lately. Now, chosen background of the day is the investigative judge in this case, a certain Senora Juana Lopez Hoyos, and featuring her because I thought it's worth looking her up to see what we know about her. First of all, it is a she, Juana. Juana, definitely a she, and that's important because in one question I threw out there the other day to the ever deluded and in denial rabid John George supporters, I said, why do you think that Madison Allen, that seems to be the devil incarnate for most of the John George supporters, it's like, why do you think Madison Allen, in specifically the John George case, has never been even interviewed, let alone arrested, mean nothing at all? She doesn't even feature as far as the investigation goes in the John George case. And I was saying, why could that be? How could that be? Why is that? What is it that this judge, Juana Lopez Hoyos, is missing from Madison Allen's testimony? And one not so wise John George addicted follower said, well, probably because Madison is sucking off the judge. Um, I don't know. I mean, if it's a female judge, I would doubt that's the explanation, unless there's something I don't know about Juana Lopez Hoyos. But I thought that response was rather typical of the ever ignorant John George Rabbit Supporters Club. They don't even know who the investigative judge is. But looking up a little bit of detail, there's not a lot about her, actually. And I've got to be honest, I don't see anything that would count against her in any way. Sometimes you go online and you see all kinds of criticisms of judge said this or judge made a bad. I don't see that. I don't see that. I mean, initial scan, if you like, of Juana Lopez Hoyos doesn't pick up anything particularly negative. But the few things that she has said did catch my attention. Talking about her particular court in Torrevieja, uh, she described it as de los más saturados y complejos del país. So it is one saturados, like saturated with cases. It is one of the most overwhelmed, we could say, and complejos, one of the most complex in the country, con numerosos procedimientos, yeah, with numerous trials, numerous proceedings, en marcha, in action, por causas de bandas criminales, connected with criminal gangs y narcotráfico, yeah, narco traffic, en cuya instrucción se ha especializado la propia López Hoyos, and in which she is a specialist. So that's interesting. Juana Lopez Hoyos is somewhat of a specialist in this overwhelmed court that is absolutely submerged in narco trafficking cases. And so I don't know how that plays out, actually. I don't think that's particularly in favor of the John George camp. I don't think it's particularly in favor of the Johnny Smith camp. But it might be that someone like Juana Lopez Hoyos would have some kind of experience in dealing with the likes of John George, who I submit always went over. This is my allegation. My intuition tells me that John George always went over to Spain to get himself involved in some kind of narco dealing, gun running, something like that, something criminal. I never ever believed from day one this was family man on holiday visiting friends. It just didn't seem plausible. I mean, in December, just before Christmas, oh yeah, family man, I'll go on holiday to visit friends. Didn't seem right. And then the whole video thing of him with Mali talking about guns, it was like, oh, there we go. Bingo. I think we've hit the real reason. So it might be that the judge does have some insight into a pattern of behavior that would be similar to John George's. And in that sense, this might be, I'm just speculating, it might be a reason she is somewhat hesitant to move forward because her job is to weigh up, would this case proceed, and would the evidence convince a jury that Johnny Smith is and must be the one guilty of pulling the trigger? I'm just saying, I think she's hesitant about that because she knows it's a fairly high bar to cross, and her doubts might be, I don't know, that the jury wouldn't buy it based on her experience of working with these narco trafficking cases. The other thing she said is about the actual court building itself and the court system. El Palacio de Justicia arrastra también graves carencias de medios. So yeah, she knows that she's basically saying that arrastra, it's like, there's a delayed effect here. A lot of these cases are taking a long time to come to court. Yeah, you don't say. Rumor out there, I don't know where it comes from, by the way, rumor out there that possibly January of 27, Johnny Smith's case, I don't know where that comes from. Anyone know where that comes from? And when you think about it, I don't think the judge is the one saying, hey, rumor has it, guys, on the 20 in January 27, we're going to have a trial. I mean, I would have thought the judge would say nothing because the judge doesn't know, or the judge would definitely say the exact date when the trial's going to happen. I don't think the judge is going to say, let me put out the rumor that it might be in January of 27. So where does that rumor come from? If it comes from the solicitor that's representing the John George family, what on earth is that solicitor doing, throwing something out there that could well be not true? I don't know. Question marks over that solicitor. But maybe, I don't know, maybe Juana Lopez Hoyos has, for some bizarre reason, told the John George family, expect January of 27 for this to happen, but hasn't told the Johnny Smith side, the Johnny Smith solicitor. That doesn't seem to be right. How do you tell one solicitor but not the other one? Um, and so I would have thought, had Juana Lopez Hoyos told both solicitors expect trial in January 27th, that would be confirmed. I don't see it confirmed. You see, I get very worried when the likes of Alison Morris say a trial is expected in January of 20. What does expected mean? What if everything goes right and the investigation is concluded? But no, I don't buy that. It's expected. No, it either is going to happen in January 27, in which case let's see the official documentation that says that, or this is speculation and rumor. It might be that the George family solicitor, feeling things are not particularly going their way, we're now heading into August and no charges have been announced still against Johnny Smith, is the George family solicitor feeling the pressure, sensing that it might not be going his way? Are we seeing a repeat of Fat Tony Armstrong here? Yeah, held in detention, held in detention, held in detention, all of a sudden released because it ain't going to fly, ain't going to stick. This trial ain't going to happen. Is that what's happening here? And in rather panic mode, George family solicitors say, oh, yeah, January 27, everyone expect that. And it's bullshit. I don't know. I'm just saying, if you believe January 27th is the trial of Johnny Smith, then at least explain where factually you get that from, as opposed to, yeah, the rumor mill said that, so therefore I'm going with it. I'm just saying. And I do want to look at recently, I do want to look at how Johnny Smith's appeal went and what seemed to me to be some bizarre statements from the judge here. Now, I'm going to be very cautious with how I approach this because I think we might have some Chinese whispers in effect here, because what we do is we have to listen to someone like Alison Morris report on the words of, I guess, the solicitor for the George family, who is reporting what the judge said, something like that. I don't know. I'm very tentative about when a certain piece of information has gone through two or three, sets of hands or mouths, why we should actually believe word for word what was said. So first of all, it was in a statement, and again, don't hold me to this. This could have been Alison Morris, it could have been Bell Tell, it could have been Crime World. I don't know where this came from, but what I read was that it was blood on Michael Malley's car that had no bearing on the case being Johnny Smith being refused his bail or being granted bail, because this was the important thing. The prosecution, I think this is Alison Morris, I'm pretty sure this is Alison Morris reporting this, because the prosecution case is this was a joint enterprise between the two, meaning because there is both Malley and Johnny Smith considered by the prosecution to effect be a team, if you like, a combo that went ahead and ended the life of John George. Because it's a combo, Johnny Smith saying, well, wait a second, the blood is on Malley's car plate, not mine. So isn't that evidence that I at least deserve bail? And I do find that odd that Alison Morris is out there saying, well, no, it's a joint enterprise, that both Malley and Johnny Smith are considered joint together as the suspects. Okay, but what happened to the whole notion that Malley was the accomplice? Up until Alison Morris said this is a joint enterprise, I thought everyone was on board with Malley's the accomplice and Johnny Smith must be the trigger man. Well, if it's a joint enterprise, all of a sudden we've got like a 50-50 scenario. In how many weeks or in how many months do we start hearing that, oh, yeah, well, it could be that Johnny Smith was the accomplice and Malley was the actual trigger man? How does this joint enterprise work? It seems to me that there's already been a shift. I really do remember Malley accomplice, Malley accomplice, Malley accomplice. And now Alison Morris saying, well, joint, yeah, prosecution cases, it was a joint enterprise. Is the next shift going to be, well, yeah, Malley more, more responsible for this death, and Johnny Smith slightly less? I don't know. That's the trend I see here. Now, we go to the phone triage. Alison Morris also reported that the evidence suggests that because of a phone triage, I call it a phone triangle, actually, locating the ping of a phone, the phone triage put both men at the property. I guess the property where the body was found. There's one small problem with that. I think Billy George, Humpty Dumpty has always insisted, I thought, that John George's body was moved there. Now, if Billy George insists that John George's body was moved there, a phone triage putting both men at the property, but not at the location where John George's life ended, kind of implies someone else might be involved, maybe. But also similar to the Jay Slater case, a phone being present in a said location doesn't obviously mean that the phone owner was there. So this is just another obstacle. And I wouldn't assume judge and jury are going to say, oh, well, if Malley's phone was there where John George's body was found, and Smith's phone was there where John George's body was found, sorry, that means that the owners of the phone must have been there. Well, maybe, likely, but you only have to Google in how many criminal cases does a person's phone appear to be in a location when they are nowhere near that location. Every time your phone is nicked, your phone is pinging away in, I don't know, it could be China somewhere. It doesn't mean you're there with the phone. So this is something, I mean, on the one hand, it is evidence. Of course it is. If the phone evidence says that Johnny Smith's phone and Michael Malley's phone are both at the property, yeah, of course that's evidence. But you know how the defense is going to play this, not the first time in his life that my client has actually been separated from his phone. Not the first time in his life my client has loaned his phone to Malley because Malley's a criminal, and yeah, occasionally it's better to use my client's phone. I don't know. I'm just saying there could be 101 reasons the defense will give to to say phone and owner weren't together on this occasion. Be that as it may, let's assume it's all right. Let's assume that both men, let's assume that Malley and Johnny Smith, both by the phone evidence, are at that location where John George was found dead. That still doesn't say which one pulled the trigger. You see, in my book, if you're going to go ahead with Johnny Smith is the trigger man here and not the accomplice, saying that two men by their phones are located here is then saying 50-50, the jury and judge. If you convict this guy, 50-50, you got it right. 50-50, you got it wrong, and the other guy was just the accomplice helping out and didn't actually, kill anyone. This is a problem too. A lot of the deluded John George supporters keep going on about Madison Allen's phone evidence. Again, has that all been submitted as evidence? Or has Madison Allen's phone evidence been disregarded totally? That's a genuine question. I don't know. You see, I would have thought if Madison Allen's phone evidence had been submitted as evidence in this case, Madison Allen herself would have been at least interviewed. It seems like Madison Allen has never ever been interviewed even in the John George case. I find that strange. And if Madison Allen's, all her phone evidence that is supposedly connected to the John George case has just been brushed aside, put aside by the Guardia Civil and the investigative judge here, then I wonder what evidence on other phones is actually going to be incriminating. I want to get to the most important point to me, and it is in the last appeal made by Johnny Smith to be released on bail. To me, again, I'm not, criticizing the judge here. I'm criticizing how it is that certain information is being put out there, Alison Morris and others, but no one seems to be actually analyzing the information. Because Alison Morris reported that the high bond offered, to secure Johnny Smith's release or release on bail would itself be a flight risk. I don't see how that works. I really don't. Because Johnny Smith has already had a period of time when he was released on bail. And Johnny Smith, during that period of time when he was released on bail, didn't try to go anywhere. He proved, in effect, he's no flight risk. So what I don't get is the logic that says, having gone through a period of being on bail and being no flight risk because he showed he didn't try to go away anywhere, where's the logic that says, but if we give him a second release on bail, that he will obviously then be a flight risk? In my mind, if you weren't deemed a flight risk the first time you were bailed, why would you be deemed a flight risk the second time? And it doesn't matter what the bail amount is, if it's a lot higher or if it's a lot lower. I don't get how the riskometer, the thing that measures risk in being in a guy taking flight, I don't understand how the riskometer suddenly goes way, way up the second time the guy's released on bail. Like I say, it should go down. I would have thought once the guy's been released on bail, he wasn't a flight risk, he didn't go anywhere, he's back in detention. To me, that's pretty good evidence the guy isn't a flight risk rather than he is. But I don't understand this line. He could use their money, I don't know whose money that is, to leave the country. It doesn't take much money to leave the country. How much money does it take? Let's just paint the scenario here. Let's imagine you're Johnny Smith, right? Let's just imagine that you put up your bail, the 100,000, whatever it is, 120,000, I don't know, it's a lot of money. And you decide you want to leave Spain. Let's just paint that scenario. You want to get out of there. Well, it doesn't cost very much money to leave Spain from Torrevieja, from Alicante. You could probably take a taxi all the way through Spain, up to the Gibraltar border, the Portuguese border, the French border. Let's say you're going to France. You'd probably take a taxi all the way there for a lot less than this bail money. It wouldn't cost that much. I mean, let's assume he's signing in every day, so he's got a 24-hour window to get out of there if he so wants. And let's assume, for the sake of argument, that his passport, I know a lot of Irish people have two passports, one for the Republic of Ireland and one for the UK. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that Johnny Smith has had to surrender the two passports if he has two passports. So let us assume, for the sake of argument, Johnny Smith doesn't actually have the ID needed to fly out of Spain. Yeah, it's actually not impossible. Depends what the destination of your flight is, but it's pretty tough. 9 times out of 10, if you're taking a flight within the Schengen zone, within the European Union, and you go check in for your flight and you don't have the passport, you only have your, I don't know, Spain residence. Your residency card isn't actually a travel document. It should be refused. But I've got to tell you, I've had it accepted before. Um, it depends on the airline, depends on the person at the desk. So, although we're told that within the Schengen zone, there is no immigration formality, for flying from one Schengen country to another, I'm just saying, let's say Johnny Smith had the idea that he could go from Alicante airport to somewhere like Poland and no one's going to check his travel document. It's a big risk. Chances are they would, and they'd say, I'm sorry, your Spanish residence card isn't a travel document. It's got to be passport. Oh dear, he doesn't have it. Or your national ID card. National ID card and residency card are two different things. If, for example, Johnny Smith were a citizen of Spain, he would have a national ID card. I don't think he is, and I don't think he does have that. So what I'm saying is the chances of Johnny Smith getting out of there, if he's such a flight risk, by using passport or national ID card is zero, assuming his passports have been confiscated and he doesn't have a national ID card. But that's not the only way to leave the country. The truth is, if Johnny Smith wanted to leave Spain and enter France, where he would no longer be under Spanish jurisdiction, and it would take yet another extradition process to try to get him back, then he could do it very simply. You know, fast train to Barcelona, local train to the border, and walk over where there ain't no guards. You're in France, and from there, go wherever you like in the Schengen area. It is an immigration-free zone. I mean, end up in Iceland if you so wanted. End up in, I don't know, Norway. End up in Slovakia. End up in Greece. 101 options there for Johnny Smith if he really wanted to make it difficult for the Spanish authorities to extradite him for the second time. So I'm just saying, I don't understand why, whatever the bail amount set is, how that would increase or decrease Johnny Smith being a flight risk. It doesn't cost that much to get out of Spain. He could have done it the first time he was on bail. And I don't get, if the judge actually said these words that Alison Morris is reporting that she said, if the judge actually said his high bond offered would be a flight risk in itself, it makes no sense to me. Apparently, she said something else. Alison Morris said something about there was the chance of interfering with a witness in the case. Again, where does the judge get that from? Is there evidence that Johnny Smith has interfered with witnesses in the case before, when he was on bail before? Now, if that's true, and the judge has evidence that Johnny Smith did try to interfere with witnesses the first time he was bailed, that's a whole different reason. That I would say, yeah, if he tried to do that the first time he was bailed, that's a good reason for refusing bail and release the second time. But if that didn't happen the first time, again, I wonder where she's getting this from. Could that just be a rumor that was fed to her? Well, rumor has it that this Johnny Smith guy, he's been interfering with witnesses, and he did when he was on bail the first time. I don't know. It's all a bit of a grey area. I'm going to end this one there because, yeah, as far as I can tell, Johnny Smith's going to be in detention for a while longer, because I get the feeling, it's just a feeling, I get the feeling that the poor judge here, Juana, I think, is looking at a case that she feels may not be able to withstand the scrutiny of judge and jury, and that the prosecution haven't quite got there with a slam dunk case. That's just my feeling. Hey, who knows? Next week we might be told it's going to happen in January, and the judge feels that yes, of course, there's sufficient evidence. As I said, I think if we're trying to get to a resolution of what happened in the John George case, and that's what I'm interested in. I've always been interested in how John George died and why it is that so many people in the John George camp assume from day one that they knew who it was that took John George's life. I've never understood how they know that. I can understand why they are prejudiced and biased against Johnny Smith. I understand that, but how they would go out and say, we know he did this, when this person suddenly doesn't know it, that's always astounded me. But I've always said I would dearly love to know step by step what happened to John George from the moment he decided to go over to Spain to the moment he breathed his last. Always wanted to know what happened to him. So maybe a trial is the best way to having those questions answered. I would agree with that. I would agree with that. One last thing that was mentioned, and I maybe have to leave this for a second video. I really don't get the whole idea, and I think it's Darren George that said this, that John George was lured over to Spain. How does that work? I mean, lured, he's not some little kid and he's told, I'll give you a, free football kit and bar of chocolate if you come over to Spain. How do you lure a grown adult over to Spain? Come over to Spain and we'll treat you to this, that, and the other. So if my problem with this is if Darren knows that John George was lured into Spain, why not just say who lured him over there and for what purpose? How did the luring work? Why did John George fall for that? And is it not Darren George that says when John George landed at Alicante Airport, when he landed in Spain, someone took his passport off him? Well, again, how does that happen? I wish Darren would be precise. Who is it that went up to John George when he landed at Alicante Airport and said, "Hey, John, how are you? By the way, you got to give me passport to. You got to give your passport to me because now that you're here, now that you've been lured here, I have to take your passport away from you." What? And John George says, "Oh, okay, here it is." Or does John George, the magnificent boxer that he was, start a fight in the airport saying, "Get your bloody hands off my passport. Who the hell are you?" I don't quite get, Darren, how this luring to Spain works and how John George just kind of hands over his passport to someone and says, I've got to take that because now you're lured here. We've got to make sure you don't get away from here. And John George says, oh, okay, there you go. And in all those phone calls to Billy George the next day, the 8 phone calls he makes the next day, he doesn't mention this. He doesn't say, Dad, I might be in some trouble here. Some guy, when I got to the airport, he asked for my passport and I gave it to him, and now I don't know where it is. I'm kind of stuck here, aren't I? Questions that never get answered in the John George case. Questions that never get asked by Alison Morris of the family of John George, because Alison Morris doesn't really want to know what happened to John George. Otherwise, she would ask these questions of the family. Alison Morris doesn't really want to debate someone like me who will ask her why she doesn't get to the bottom of this case. Yeah, she's hiding under a table. She knows if she has a one-on-one unedited conversation with me, I will be going through, sifting through all the facts that she says are facts that don't seem to be facts. And this is why it's a baffling case. But I'll leave it there. And I will say, hasta luego, adios, hasta la vista, and I will see you next time.